A mayor pulled over for no reason, racial profiling, and a fight for justice. This is just the beginning. Will Cedarville's leader rise above it all? Watch to find out. James Carter's hands drummed steadily against the worn leather of his steering wheel, the rhythm punctuating the silence in the car. The long day at City Hall was still fresh in his mind. Long hours spent with lawyers, city planners, and developers, each decision pulling him in different directions. He had been looking forward to a rare moment of quiet, an evening to himself, away from the constant hum of public life. His thoughts drifted to his apartment, a sanctuary from the chaos of his political duties, when a flash of red and blue lights cut through the calm, pulling him out of his reverie. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was certain of that. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't been weaving in and out of traffic. Nothing to warrant a stop. His first instinct was to pull over to the shoulder, his fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter as his gaze flicked to the rear-view mirror. The police cruiser followed closely behind, its sirens still whirling, the harsh colors of the lights flickering in the reflection. He eased the car to the side of the road, gravel crunching under the tires, the quiet evening air heavy with tension. The street was empty, and the small, sleepy neighborhood where he lived felt distant, as though the noise of the city had suddenly been swallowed whole. The officer's footsteps approached, and James let out a long breath, attempting to steady himself. His pulse quickened, but he masked it with a calm demeanor as the officer's shadow fell over his window. "Good evening, officer," James said, his voice steady, betraying none of the confusion that stirred beneath the surface. The officer, a burly man in his mid-30s with an air of authority, leaned down, his uniform stiff and immaculate under the dimming sky. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" His voice was curt, almost dismissive. James felt a flicker of frustration, but chose to keep his voice even. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer." The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning the interior of the car with a practiced gaze. James could feel the weight of his scrutiny as he awaited the officer's next words. The officer's eyes didn't leave James as he took a slow step back, glancing at the small, neatly parked sedan with a mixture of disdain and suspicion. His voice cut through the silence again, this time sharper. "I'm going to need to see your license and registration." James hesitated for a moment. There was a growing unease in his chest that he couldn't ignore. He had been through countless encounters with law enforcement before, mostly on the other side of the table, on the receiving end of questions about city initiatives, policies, and budget meetings. But this felt different. It felt like more than just a routine traffic stop. Taking a deep breath, James reached into his glove compartment and pulled out the necessary documents. As he handed them over, he caught the officer's eyes again, noticing the tight grip on his belt and the way he kept his hand near his weapon, as if poised for something James couldn't quite place. "Is there a specific reason for the stop?" James asked, his voice calm but laced with a hint of frustration he couldn't entirely suppress. He had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations, but something about the officer's demeanor made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The officer took the papers slowly, flipping them over as if searching for something. "Anything that could explain this? I noticed you were driving a little too close to the center line. We like to make sure everything's in order here, especially when things seem a bit out of place." James blinked, confusion taking root in his gut. The streets were clear, empty except for the occasional house light, glowing in the distance. "I drive this way every day," James replied, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. "There's no issue with the road. I've been driving the same route for years." The officer said nothing, his gaze unwavering. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to maintain his composure. His hand gripped the wheel tightly, his thoughts racing, as the officer continued to scrutinize with a look that felt more like an interrogation than a routine check. "What's really going on here?" James muttered under his breath, almost to himself, though the officer heard him clearly. The tension in the air thickened, and something deep inside James told him that this wasn't about a center line. Not at all. The officer stood there, still holding James's driver's license, his eyes scanning the information like he was looking for a flaw in the details. James could feel the officer's gaze, sharp as a knife, probing, dissecting. He tried to stay calm, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, but the longer the officer stood there without speaking, the more unsettled James became. "Everything's fine, officer. I live just a few blocks away, right in the neighborhood," James said, hoping his calm tone would defuse the situation. But the officer didn't seem to be listening. Instead, he seemed to be searching for something more, some reason to justify the discomfort rising between them. The officer's eyes flickered back to James. "Just a few blocks, huh? You sure about that?" His tone had shifted now, no longer just questioning but challenging, like James had something to prove. "Yes, I'm sure. I've lived here for a while," James replied, his voice still steady, though the prickling sensation of unease was now crawling up his spine. The officer took a slow step forward, bringing himself closer to the window, his posture now stiff with authority. "You don't look like you belong here. This is a nice neighborhood, Mr. Jones. Not exactly the kind of place where someone like you would usually be seen strolling around." James froze for a moment, the words cutting through him like a blade. He could feel his jaw tightening, his breath growing shallow. The officer's implication was as clear as day. His presence, his mere existence, was out of place in this area. "That's not what you meant to say, right?" James asked, his voice lower now, the edge of frustration creeping in. He wasn't about to be intimidated. Not like this. The officer's lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Jones." James's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. The officer's body language was speaking louder than his words now. This wasn't a standard stop. This wasn't about the center line. This was something more, something personal. James took a breath, glanced at his watch, and then reluctantly unbuckled his seatbelt. His heart was pounding, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to end quietly. As James stepped out of the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another routine stop. The officer's movements were deliberate, methodical, but there was an underlying aggression that he couldn't ignore. The cool evening air seemed to press in around him, the hum of passing cars the only sound. But everything felt heavier now, like the weight of the officer's suspicion was pressing down on his shoulders. The officer motioned for James to stand by the curb while he began searching his car. James crossed his arms, trying to stay composed, but the nerves were starting to show. He couldn't help but glance down the street, where a few curious pedestrians slowed to watch the scene unfold. Their glances were fleeting, but James could feel the weight of their eyes on him. He was all too aware of what was happening, what they were seeing. "Relax," James muttered under his breath, trying to reassure himself. He was the mayor. He didn't need to be treated like this. He shouldn't have to prove anything to anyone, especially not a stranger who was making assumptions about him based on nothing more than his skin color. But there he was, standing on the side of the road like a suspect. The officer moved like a man who expected to find something. Anything. He poked around the back seat, lifting the gym bag, rummaging through the center console, peering under the seats as though the car itself was hiding a secret. James clenched his fists at his sides. "There's nothing in there," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I'm just trying to get home." The officer ignored him, continuing his search with an air of superiority. As time dragged on, James's patience started to fray. This had gone from a simple traffic stop to a full-on search without any reasonable cause. His fingers itched to reach for his phone, to call his office and have someone come down here. But something told him that making a scene wouldn't help. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the officer stood up, wiping his hands on his pants and muttering under his breath. "Well, guess what? Nothing illegal in here. But I don't like how you're handling this, Mr. Mayor." James's jaw tightened. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice steady but with a bite of anger creeping in. The officer just looked at him, his expression unreadable, and shrugged. "Just a hunch," he muttered, as though the whole thing was an inconvenience to him. James wasn't going to let this slide. This was more than just a misunderstanding. This was about power, race, and authority, and he wasn't backing down. James took a deep breath as he stood there, the cool air biting at his skin. His pulse raced, but he was determined to keep his composure. The officer had just finished rifling through his car, and James could tell by the look on his face that this wasn't going to end any time soon. "I need to run a check on your records," the officer had said, but James wasn't sure what that meant. His name was clean, his record spotless. He had nothing to hide. But what was this really about? Was this a routine stop, or was it something else? James glanced at his watch. His evening was slipping away. He had plans, a life to get back to. Yet here he was, in the middle of a neighborhood street, being treated like a criminal. He was the mayor, for crying out loud. And here he was, being questioned, searched, and scrutinized over what seemed like a trivial and baseless stop. This wasn't the first time he'd been on the receiving end of racial prejudice, but it was certainly the most personal. He had spent his life trying to break down barriers, to serve his community and make Cedarville a better place for everyone. Yet somehow, the simple act of taking a drive home had become a public display of everything that was wrong with the system. As the officer finally returned to his cruiser, James had the strange sensation of time slowing down. He stood there, his eyes shifting from the officer to bystanders who had started to gather, watching, whispering. It was an uncomfortable reminder of the scrutiny he lived under every day. His skin color made him a target, whether he was at work in his office or simply out for a drive. The officer came back, clipboard in hand, his expression colder than before. James noticed a slight smirk playing on his lips, as if he enjoyed the control he had in this moment. "I'm going to issue you a citation," the officer said, his voice gruff, almost smug. "A citation for what?" James asked, his voice tight with disbelief. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply been trying to make it home after a long day at City Hall. The officer handed him the citation, still showing no signs of kindness. "Sign here," he said, and James almost snapped. He didn't want to sign anything, but he didn't want to make the situation worse either. So, with a mix of frustration and resignation, he signed the paper, staring the officer down as if to say, "I know what you're doing and it won't work." The officer's face remained impassive, but inside, James was seething. This was far from over. The game of power had just begun. As James sat in the booking area, the sterile walls of the police station seemed to close in around him. The noise of ringing phones, the clicking of keyboards, and murmured conversations felt like a backdrop to the chaos in his mind. His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to relax. There was no use in getting angry now. He had to think clearly. He knew what had happened wasn't just a random traffic stop. This was a clear case of racial profiling, an abuse of power. The officer, Reynolds, had left the room, probably to make his usual phone call to whoever else was involved in these absurd routines. James could feel his body tensing with every passing second, as if his very presence was being questioned. It was the first time in years that he felt truly powerless. Here he was, the mayor of Cedarville, and yet he was being treated like any other random man pulled over for no reason. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. "We'll need to confirm your identity before we proceed," said a booking officer, her voice polite but laced with discomfort. James nodded, his stomach tight with unease. The way they were handling this was so routine, so ordinary for them. Yet for him, this was surreal. "I've already told you who I am," James said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm the mayor of the city. I've done nothing wrong." The words felt empty as soon as they left his mouth. He knew that in situations like this, the system didn't care about titles or reputation. It only cared about the narrative the officer had already decided. The booking officer handed him a form, her eyes filled with an apologetic sympathy. She didn't need to say anything. Her expression spoke volumes. She was caught between protocol and the realization that something was very wrong here. James leaned back in the chair, eyes staring into the ceiling, lost in thought. The world outside continued, as if nothing had happened. But inside the station, his world had turned upside down. He could hear the sounds of the officers talking, the muffled laughter as they went about their usual business. But to him, the only thing that mattered now was the principle of what had just happened. He would fight this. He had to, as his paperwork was processed. James knew he couldn't just let this slide. The fight wasn't just for him. It was for the city he had worked so hard to lead, for the community that relied on him to be their voice, their advocate. He wouldn't be silenced. This was about more than just a citation. It was about justice, equality, and accountability. And no matter how long it took, he would make sure the truth came to light. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer returned. "We've confirmed your identity," she said, handing him papers. You're free to go." But there was no apology, no acknowledgement of the injustice that had just occurred. James stood up, his mind already working through the next steps. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The car's headlights illuminated the winding streets of Cedarville as James drove home, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The cool air coming through the cracked window did little to calm the fire burning in his chest. He could still feel the tension, the humiliation, and the anger from the station, but above all, he felt an overwhelming determination. The encounter had shaken him to his core, but it also lit a spark. He knew he couldn't let this moment slip by without turning it into something meaningful. Cedarville deserved better than a police department that operated without accountability. He had to act, not just for his own sake, but for every person in the city who had ever been wronged by a system that should protect them, not oppress them. As he pulled into his driveway, the house, quiet and still, seemed like a temporary sanctuary. The lights in the windows were dim, and the moonlight cast a gentle glow across the front lawn. But James knew that the peace he felt in his home tonight would be short-lived. The weight of what had happened lingered like a storm on the horizon. He stepped out of the car and made his way up the steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. Inside, his wife, Olivia, was waiting for him. Her worried gaze met his as soon as he walked through the door. She could see the storm in his eyes, the kind of look she knew too well. It was the same one he had when something wasn't right, when he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "James," she said, her voice soft but filled with concern. "What happened?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as he dropped his keys onto the table. "I was pulled over for no reason. The officer treated me like a criminal." His voice faltered slightly, but he steadied himself. "And he didn't even recognize me." I couldn't believe it. Olivia's expression softened. She stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "But you're okay, right?" James nodded, but the frustration remained. "I'm fine, but this isn't about me. This is bigger than one bad officer. It's about how many people in this city are treated like this every day, and nobody does anything about it." She stood there, her eyes reflecting both worry and understanding. "What are you going to do about it?" A slow smile tugged at James's lips, a flicker of resolve breaking through the anger. "I'm going to make sure it never happens again." He paused, his voice firm. "I'll use this, everything that happened today, to push for real change. The city deserves better." Olivia squeezed his arm. "And you'll have my support, always." James took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing just a little. "It's not going to be easy, but this is just the beginning. I'm not going to let this go." The weight in his chest had shifted. He wasn't just a mayor now. He was the voice of accountability in Cedarville. And nothing, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult, would stop him from seeing this fight through. The next morning, Marcus woke up to the hum of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. He had barely slept, his mind still churning with the events of the night before. The pressure was mounting, and there was no turning back now. The realization that his town, his city, was at a crossroads hit him hard. Cedarville needed change, and Marcus was determined to make that change happen. As he reached for his phone, the screen lit up with a text from Carla. "Meeting at City Hall, 9 a.m. sharp. Bring your thoughts and your resolve." He rubbed his eyes and groaned, already feeling the weight of the day ahead. By the time he arrived at City Hall, a small crowd of reporters had gathered outside. Their cameras flashed, capturing every moment, every detail of his entrance. It was as if they were waiting for something spectacular to unfold. They didn't know it, but Marcus was ready to give them just that. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Carla was already at her desk, reviewing a stack of papers. She looked up as he entered, giving him a knowing glance. "You ready?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Marcus nodded, pulling up a chair. "We don't have time to waste," he said. "I've spent too many years ignoring the cracks in this system. No more. I'm going to do everything I can to fix it." Carla raised an eyebrow. "And you think today's the day?" "Today is just the start," Marcus replied, his voice filled with determination. "I'm not waiting anymore. This town needs action, not promises." Their conversation was cut short as Chief Anderson walked in, the tall, imposing figure stepped through the door, his uniform pressed and sharp, but his expression was guarded. The tension in the room thickened instantly. "I'm glad we're all here," Chief Anderson said, his voice measured. "Let's get to the point." Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. "I want to make sure that every officer in this department understands that accountability is not optional. It's the foundation of change." Anderson took a seat, but his eyes remained fixed on Marcus. "You're right, but change takes time. We can't just force things overnight." Marcus let out a breath, his frustration barely contained. "Time? How much more time do we need, Chief? People's lives are at stake. You can't measure justice in days or weeks. You measure in actions." The room grew still. Everyone was waiting for Marcus's next move, his next words to solidify his commitment to the fight ahead. "I'm here to make sure we don't just talk about change," he said, his voice rising. "We start today, and we do what's right, no matter how difficult it gets. I'm not backing down. This is my city, and I'll fight for it." With that, the room shifted. The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air, and for the first time, he felt like he wasn't just a mayor. He was a catalyst for something bigger, something that couldn't be stopped. The journey had begun, and it was going to be a long, hard road. But he was ready. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, calls, and decisions. Marcus was no stranger to pressure, but this was different. He could feel the weight of an entire community watching him, waiting for him to lead them through the storm. Cedarville had never been in a place like this before. Its foundation was being shaken, and the cracks were hard to ignore. One afternoon, as Marcus sat at his desk, the hum of the city outside seemed to echo in his ears. The reforms, the changes, the promises made, they were all beginning to take shape. But as the new policies were being drafted and discussed, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had pushed for this, fought for this, but was it enough? The question lingered in his mind as he looked at the city map pinned on the wall, marking the neighborhoods that had been hardest hit by the recent turmoil. It was the same map he had stared at countless times during his career, but today it seemed different. Today it was personal. Carla entered the room, holding a thick folder in her hands. "Got a minute?" she asked, her voice quiet but serious. Marcus nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. Carla sat down and opened the folder, revealing the latest report from the Community Outreach Program. She paused for a moment, letting the silence settle between them before speaking. "These numbers, Marcus," she said, pointing to the data in the report. "It's working. People are listening. But we have to keep this momentum going. We can't let up. The reforms are a start, but real change, true change, it starts with us. It starts with understanding, not just policies." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the desk. "I know, but sometimes it feels like no matter how much we do, it's not enough. I've seen the same faces at every meeting, and yet it feels like we're just spinning our wheels." Carla's gaze softened. "Because change isn't just about doing, it's about being. You've shown them what's possible, Marcus. You've led by example. But now it's time to trust that the community can carry it forward too." Marcus sighed, the weight of the responsibility heavy on his shoulders. "I guess I'm just afraid that I'm not enough, that my efforts won't make the kind of difference people need." Carla smiled, her eyes steady. "You already have. But don't forget, this is about more than you. It's about us all. And that's how we'll win, together." Marcus looked at the report again, but this time it wasn't just data. It was hope, a tangible, growing thing that had taken root in Cedarville. Maybe, just maybe, he could believe in the future they were building. And as the sun began to set over the city, Marcus made a vow to himself. The road ahead would be tough, but he would never stop trying to make things better. For Cedarville, for its people, for the future. The days turned into weeks, and the steady progress Marcus had hoped for began to show its true colors. The city of Cedarville was changing, slowly but surely, and Marcus couldn't deny the small victories that had already begun to emerge. As the streets began to feel less tense, as the meetings grew more constructive, he found himself quietly optimistic about the future. But there was still work to be done. One morning, As the sun filtered through the blind of his office, Marcus sat with a cup of coffee, scanning through the latest reports. The numbers were encouraging. Crime had dropped by 12%, and public trust in law enforcement had increased by 15%. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The reforms had been implemented. The training programs were underway. But Marcus knew change took time. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on his office door. Carla entered, holding a folder, her face more serious than usual. She placed it on his desk, and without a word, sat down across from him. "What is it?" Marcus asked, his voice tired but steady. "It's a community outreach report," Carla said. "I wanted to go over the next steps with you." She opened the folder, revealing pages of feedback and suggestions from the citizens of Cedarville. But there was something else, an unsettling note at the end of the report. "Marcus," Carla began, "we've been seeing a shift. The community is coming together, but there's still some resistance. There's still work to be done. Some people feel like the reforms are just a tick-the-box exercise, like it's not enough to change their lives." Marcus stared at the report for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. "But we've done everything right. We've listened to them. We've implemented policies. We've made it clear that things will be different." "Maybe, but it's not about what we've done. It's about what we've shown them. We can't just preach change. We have to live it every day. Actions speak louder than words, Marcus." Her words stung, but they also rang true. Marcus knew she was right. It wasn't enough to simply enact laws or implement new training programs. The community had to see that the changes were real, that they were felt on the ground level, in their everyday lives. It was a wake-up call. The true test of leadership wasn't about having the right ideas or making the right decisions. It was about being consistent, day in and day out, and showing up for the people who depended on him. Marcus sat back in his chair, taking a long, deep breath. He knew what needed to be done. They had come a long way, but it was time to keep pushing. It was time to be relentless, not just in the work he did, but in the way he lived the changes he wanted to see. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Marcus made a promise to himself, one he would keep every day moving forward. He would never stop fighting for Cedarville, and he would never stop proving that change was real. It was a lesson he'd learned the hard way, but it was one he would carry with him forever.